Okay, here we are in Unit 8, Preparation for the U.S. History End of Course Test. Unit 8 is going to have all of Standard 20 in it, and Standard 21D is going to be in there. It's about Sputnik, the Soviet unmanned satellite. We'll talk about those. But the title here is America as a World Power, the Cold War, and this whole unit's about post-World War II foreign policy. Foreign policy, United States policies toward other nations. We're going to talk about what happens after World War II. And we're going to look at the language of the standards again. This is a standards-based classroom. So let's do that. And we're going to start with 20. Here's 20. Here we have A, B, C, D, E. We have 5 substandards. Alright, so let's look at this top one here. The student will analyze the domestic and international impact of the Cold War on the United States. So we're going to analyze how the Cold War impacted the United States domestically and internationally. Okay. Alright, so here's 20A. Describe the creation of the Marshall Plan, U.S. commitment to Europe, the Truman Doctrine, and the origins and implications of the containment policy. So we have about 4 things there we need to look at. Let's look at that. Let's see. Containment is a focus. Containment doctrine is how it originated, and then what were the implications of it. And then the Truman Doctrine, and then the Marshall Plan. We're going to look at those elements there. And we're going to look at NATO, how the United States was committed to Europe here. And the Truman Doctrine is also a commitment, somewhat of one, to Greece and Turkey anyway. NATO would be to Europe as a whole. And we'll look at those. International relations, political and social interactions in the Cold War will be the theme. So let's jump into the Cold War and talk about what the Cold War is. The Cold War was really not considered at like physical war with people killing one another, although there are going to be some implications of Cold War containment policy. It caused wars to happen throughout the world that really are caused by this Cold War ideological tensions or competition between the United States and the Soviet Union or USSR. So the Cold War, when we say the Cold War, we're talking about the ideological tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States is capitalistic, Soviet Union is communist. That dominated both nations' foreign policies, and which many feared would lead to a hot war that involved those nuclear weapons like the United States detonated in Japan. So there was a lot of fear involved in this Cold War stuff. But its ideological tensions are competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Right after the war, the Soviet Union had invaded Berlin, and the United States and France and Great Britain really got in an argument over what was the future of Berlin, Germany. And the communist sector, the Soviet Union, wanted Berlin to be a communist country. And then the United States and the Western allies, France and Great Britain, wanted Berlin to be capitalistic in its economy. And so this is the beginning of this Cold War dispute or ideological tensions and competitions between the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, the USSR, and then these Western nations like the United States. Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, indicated this split between East and West. And when in a speech he says, a shadow has fallen, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. So he's talking about this split right here in the middle of Berlin, but it actually is going to cause there to be a split in Europe as well, and the United States, where these communist nations are going to split and want to advance communism into Berlin, Germany, and elsewhere, and then these non-communist or capitalist or neutral countries that are against this expansion of communism. So he's talking about this Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill wasn't talking about a literal Iron Curtain. He's talking about an ideology, the thinking, the competition of what economy is better. So Berlin is going to be divided. Let me bring this up. Berlin after World War II was divided into Western democracies, what we call Western Berlin, and then the eastern Berlin over here in the Soviet Union's control. And in the 1960s, the Soviet Union is going to build an actual wall across Berlin called the Berlin Wall. And in 1989, Ronald Reagan's going to ask for them to tear down the wall, and Mikhail Gorbachev is actually going to tear down the wall. In 1989, 1990, the Cold War will come to an end. But here's the Iron Curtain he was talking about was more of ideological tensions, this competition between the United States and Western powers that were capitalist in their economy, and the Soviet Union that was communist in its economy. And so these ideological tensions are economic competition between these two countries, and everything political would be backed by these economic goals. And so it's the splitting of Berlin in two over this argument, and Europe in this argument, that is really the heart of the Cold War. And if you can't remember the difference between capitalism and communism, I encourage you to go back and look at Unit 5 and all that. Okay, or Unit 6, I believe. I can't remember which one is in, but it's on one of the videos. Alright, so what we have here in the Cold War is the United States capitalism over here versus USSR communism. Now, some of the characteristics are the United States wanted to rebuild Europe, and wanted Europe to be ruled by democracy. In other words, the private ownership of business we talked about was one of the things the United States, and capitalism and in free speech and free press and free government are the characteristics of United States capitalism. The Soviet Union, the United Soviet Socialist Republic that was communist under Joseph Stalin, really wanted to control and spread their communism throughout the world. They used censorship, didn't believe in free speech and free press, that the government should control business, and that it was a rule by totalitarianism. That was the United States claim. And anyway, so it's this Eastern communism versus Western capitalism that is the heart of the Cold War. So that is the Cold War defined, okay? Now let's look at this. It says we need to talk about the origins and implication of what's called the containment policy. So let's talk about containment real quick. And containment is going to be the United States foreign policy. And foreign policy means, how does the United States deal with other nations? And we talked about foreign policy before all the way through this class. For instance, from 1789 to 1898, the Spanish-American War, the United States' foreign policy was neutrality. Stay out of foreign affairs, don't get entangled in alliance. We took George Washington's farewell address to heart, and that's what we tried to do. There's a few exceptions, but we tried to stay neutral. And then in World War I came, actually the result of us turning our foreign policy to expansionism out into the Pacific Ocean to get Hawaii, the Philippine Islands, Guam, and then down in the Caribbean with Puerto Rico, and then in Latin America with the Panama Canal. We see that we changed from neutrality in our U.S. foreign policy to big stick diplomacy with Theodore Roosevelt, and we expanded out past the United States continental borders. And then at the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, his 14 points, Treaty of Versailles, because of the League of Nations, the United States and those senators wanted to become isolated again in their foreign policy with the world. In other words, neutral and isolated from worldly affairs. Until 1941, we saw FDR wanted to help Great Britain during World War II with the Lend-Lease Act, and then with the attack on Pearl Harbor, we changed from isolationism to engagement in World War II and world affairs. So right here, containment is going to be our foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, from 1945 to about 1990. It's going to change a little bit through there, but and we're going to see some changes as we get there. But containment is the Cold War U.S. foreign policy. So let's look at that. Where did it come from? So the U.S. foreign policy of containment was created and designed because the Soviet Union, the USSR, United Soviet Socialist Republic, that was communist, threatened and made a public statement that its goal was to spread communism throughout the world. Now, under communism, it's the total opposite of capitalism. They don't believe in private property. They don't believe in anything like that. And so we see that this USSR, Soviet Union spreading of communism is a direct threat to the United States and capitalism, or the Western powers and capitalism. So the focus of the United States under the containment policy and the foreign policy, the reason they created it was the Soviet Union said they were going to spread communism throughout the world. So their focus was on containing, blocking, or stopping communism where it already was. Keep it from spreading. It's almost like cancer treatment. To keep cancer from spreading, you use all types of treatments, the doctor will, to keep it from spreading any further. And so containment policy was the way the United States and its foreign policies tried to stop the spread of communism throughout the world. It came from and originated from a guy by the name of George F. Kennan. We're going to look at a picture of him in a minute. He sends his long telegram to the Truman administration, actually to Secretary of State George Marshall. And in this 8,000 word telegram, he answers a question about how to deal with the Soviet Union, because George Kennan is an advisor about Soviet Union policies. And in it, he advocates that the United States needed to try to stop the spread of communism. In other words, what we call containment by the USSR. And here's what he said. The USSR still lives in antagonistic capitalist encirclement, with which in the long run there can be no permanent peaceful coexistence. In other words, capitalism and communism could not coexist one another, and the USSR was an antagonistic force against capitalism. So George F. Kennan becomes known as the father of containment policy. And he, at the time, was in 1946, February 22nd, 1946, when he sent a telegram, was the deputy chief of mission for the United States government in Moscow, in the USSR. And he part of his speech, he talks about Stalin's speech that he made in 1927 to American workers. And he says, in course of further development of international revolution, there will emerge, this is Stalin saying this, two centers of world significance. A socialist center, drawing to itself the countries which tend towards socialism, and a capitalist center, meaning the United States and Western powers, drawing itself to countries that incline toward capitalism. Battle between these two centers for command of world economy will decide the fate of capitalism and of communism in the entire world. This is what Kennan says, why he says that they can't coexist, because this is Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, saying this, that there would be a battle between the socialist center and the capitalist center over the world. And so this is the origins of what we call containment policy. Now it says, describe the creation of the Truman Doctrine. Now, President Truman is going to take George Kennan's advice and use containment in the world. So the Truman Doctrine indicates that he is going to use containment. And let's look at this. President Harry Truman stated the U.S. Intervene and aid other nations attempting to resist communism. Greece and Turkey were under attack by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was trying to spread its communism down into Greece and Turkey. We're going to look at, let's go ahead and look at a map of that. Here's Greece, and here's Turkey, and here's the Soviet Union up here. So Truman wanted the United States to help Greece and help Turkey resist Soviet spread of communism there. So the Truman Doctrine is, he's going to ask the Congress for $400 million. And when he does this, he's going to commit the United States to use its military and economic strength to block the expansion of Soviet influence in strategic areas such as Greece, Turkey, and Western Europe. Now let's listen to him ask Congress for that money. This highlighted here is what is considered the Truman Doctrine, and this is a request to Congress for aid and help for Greece and Turkey. Let's listen to this first part. Here it is here.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
Alright, and then down here he says that
free peoples of the world look to us for support.
me do this. Sorry.
Free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom.
Okay, so they're looking for us, Greece and Turkey are looking for us to help them maintain freedom. In other words, the Soviet Union communism has nothing to do with freedom. So this is called the Truman Doctrine, this that is highlighted here. And here's the second part where you request Congress help there.
If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
Okay. And down here is where he asks.
I therefore ask the Congress to provide authority for assistance to Greece and Turkey in the amount of $400 million for.
Alright, so he's asking for help for Greece and Turkey down here. And the Truman Doctrine, he's saying that the United States needs to help free peoples in Europe. And see, in this Truman Doctrine, he's going to commit the United States to help European countries. This marks a change from isolationism to get involved in European affairs. This is a marked change away from the Monroe Doctrine. And it changes foreign policy to that of being committed and helping European countries like Greece and Turkey here. So this is a change in our foreign policy here. This containment policy, stopping the spread of communism, becomes a change in U.S. foreign policy. And we're going to look at that more later. All right, describe the creation of the Marshall Plan, and this is going to be part of Truman's, containment that he got from Keenan, and he's going to use the Marshall Plan as a way of putting money into Europe to get it to resist the spread of communism there. So let's look at the Marshall Plan. Western Europe had been destroyed by Germany bombarding it. This is a picture here of London when Germany bombarded London. And the destruction there and all over Europe had caused a lot of collapse in the production of these countries and making goods and farming and food implements to get the food to people and to have their economy running again is going to take a lot to get them on their feet. So Secretary of State George Marshall and George F. Keenan are going to ask Congress, and the President's going to push Congress and ask them to help European nations rebuild or reconstruct themselves after World War II. And here he is in a June 5th, 1947 speech at Harvard University saying why the Marshall Plan was so important.
It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. Any government that is willing to assist in the task of recovery will find full cooperation, I am sure, on the part of the United States government. Any government which maneuvers to block the recovery of other countries cannot expect help from us.
Okay, so in this you can see, to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. In other words, free institutions, the United States did not think that the Soviet Union had free institutions. So this is political language, but the thing is to help return to normal economic health for Europe. And if normal economic health returns, capitalism returns. And in giving this aid, it would help Europe resist turning to communism. And so that's what the Marshall Plan was for. And it was actually called the European Recovery Program, but called the Marshall Plan in name of George Marshall, Secretary of State. And to promote European recovery and reconstruction, an integral part of Truman's policy of containment to stop spread of communism, it lasts for 4 years, from April 1948 to 1951. $13 billion in economic aid is going to be sent to Europe to help rebuild. And the Marshall Plan here shows in Europe where the money went. We sent some to Greece, we sent some to Turkey. This is part of the Truman Doctrine here. Also some military help there. to give them money to buy tank or build tanks or buy them or guns or whatever they needed. And so this is where most of the money went. You see France and Great Britain got a lot of the money. Those were our allies that fought during World War II. So it was a financial plan to help alleviate the suffering of the people that were starving. So we sent a lot of foodstuffs to help Europe renew its transportation system, modernize its industrial and agricultural equipment so it can feed its own and become self-sufficient, and resume normal economic production and trade under capitalism. That's what it was for. So there's that. And here's some people getting a care package from the Marshall Plan. And here's some grain here in these bags from this Marshall Plan, or European Recovery. And here's a tractor being sent over there to help them, and these cars are actually sent as well. This equipment over here was sent to help Europe rebuild and to farm and make foodstuffs for their people. And here's some people restructuring because of the Marshall Plan. There's a sign there indicating that to help Europe reconstruct. Here's a political cartoon, shows European recovery, the Marshall Plan, and this guy here is Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union trying to block it, and that's just asking. Yeah, anyway, that's just a political cartoon about the Marshall Plan. Here's one here because there was a delay in Congress passing the Marshall Plan bill. There it is, Marshall Plan delay. It shows a Capitol building there. Here's Western Europe, and this big bear here is communism, or the Soviet Union, moving in. So to keep Western Europe from falling to this communism, they issued the Marshall Plan money. To keep them different and separate, and to try to understand the differences between the two, because a lot of my students have voiced that they can't understand the difference between the Marshall Plan and the doctrine, Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan was meant to give money, financial, and other help and aid to Western Europe to help it rebuild, to restructure its economy. We see these bags of grain and food and that tractor a few moments ago. That's what it's for, to prevent Europe from falling to communism, Western Europe falling communism, and also to help those who are hungry. But the Truman Doctrine was to send money and weapons, or money for weapons, to Greece and Turkey as military aid to Greece and Turkey to help it defend itself against the Soviet Union, who was actively already there. So this visual, I hope, will help you understand the difference. Although in Greece and Turkey, and a part of the Monroe Doctrine is that some of the Marshall Plan money and economic aid went to Greece and Turkey as well. So, alright. Now let's turn to the U.S. commitment to Europe. Truman's doctrine was a commitment to Europe in certain respects, Greece and Turkey, and to Western Europe, although it offered to the Soviet Union some help and to other countries, but they refused because they didn't want to be controlled by capitalism. But the creation in the United States at the end of World War II, NATO, was a commitment of the United States to Europe. So the United States at the end of World War II, 1945, FDR actually put this in place to be created, very instrumental in putting this into place. The United States joins with 10 other European nations over here in Europe, in blue, see? They're all part of NATO, and Canada even, up here, as a international defensive military alliance against the spread of communism, against the Soviet Union. And they formed to contain or stop the spread of communism throughout the world. So they joined this international league to try to prevent another war, try to prevent the spread of communism from the Soviet Union. And this is a dramatic departure here. And NATO means North Atlantic Treaty Organization. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Here's the Atlantic Ocean. If you notice, these countries are in the North Atlantic Ocean part here of the world. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and that was their goal, was to contain in Northern Atlantic, contain the spread of communism, stop it from spreading there. Now this is important to know because the United States joining the international goals of NATO was a marked difference, a decisive break from America's tradition of isolationism. If you recall, the predecessor of the UN we're about to talk about, the League of Nations. We didn't join because we wanted to stay isolated. We didn't want to get involved in these affairs of European affairs. We didn't even, we didn't want to involve ourselves over here because of the Monroe Doctrine agreement. But now, after the end of World War II, we see that the United States joins NATO, this international league here, to stop the spread of communism, as a marked decision to break away from isolationism. Okay. As a result, and in response to the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Soviet Union creates what is known as the Warsaw Pact, or this group of communist countries. You know, I equate this to gang territories. I see this, I say, yeah, these are gangs. You know, you have NATO, one gang, and Warsaw Pact, the other gang. Communists versus capitalism. Gang warfare here. But anyway, you see that Cuba and Nicaragua down here are eventually going to join the Warsaw Pact and become communist. And that's close over here in the Western Hemisphere. And we're going to have some problems down here with Cuba in the 1960s we're about to talk about, and then Nicaragua in the 1980s. And we'll look at those later on and see how they impact our history. Okay. Another thing we do in 1945 is create, and FDR was involved in this as well, the United Nations. And the United Nations is the it takes up where the League of Nations were. The League of Nations were kind of done away with because they were inefficient in preventing World War II from happening. And if you remember the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson established that. We never joined because of isolationism. And this league didn't do anything about the expansionism of Mussolini or Hitler when we talk about those expansionist policies, or Japan, and so didn't do anything to prevent World War II. So FDR and other nations got together and established the United Nations to take the place of the League of Nations. We actually are very active in establishing this thing, and United Nations is actually located in Manhattan, New York City. Headquarters is there. There's headquarters all over the world, though, 2 or 3 other locations, but the headquarters is located in Manhattan. In 1945, 51 member nations joined. We were part of those nations, and today there's 193 member nations of the United Nations. Okay. So here we see our foreign policy changed from isolationism to containment. That's what we say. Now, we're going to look at here, what is the impact or implications of the containment policies? We've talked about all these. Let's talk about the implications of containment policy. What's going to happen, and what we're going to talk about in the next series of videos, is how the containment policies through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s all the way up to 89 are going to cause certain incidents to happen. Like the fall of China, Korean War, McCarthyism, the Red Scare of the 1950s, and then Cuba. In that region, we're going to have some hostilities occur in the Vietnam War, and we're going to talk about those in the next series of videos. But these are the implications, these things that happened during this Cold War period. So the Cold War and containment policies start with the Truman Doctrine in 1947 and end with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. All right, I hope this helps you. I hope we've met our objectives to describe the creation of the Marshall Plan, U.S. commitment to Europe, and the Truman Doctrine, and the origins and implications of containment policies. Ask questions in class. Good luck on the quiz test, EOCT. Containment policy. It caused wars to happen throughout the world that really are caused by this Cold War ideological tensions or competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, or USSR. So the Cold War, when we say the Cold War, we're talking about the ideological tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States is capitalistic, Soviet Union is communist. That dominated both nations' foreign policies, and which many feared would lead to a hot war. Here's 20A. Describe the creation of the Marshall Plan, U.S. commitment to Europe, the Truman Doctrine, and the origins and implications of containment policy. So we have about 4 things there we need to look at. Let's look at that. Let's see. Containment is a focus. Containment doctrine is how it originated, and then what were the implications of it. And then the Truman Doctrine, and then the Marshall Plan, We're going to look at those elements there, and we're going to look at NATO, how the United States was committed to Europe here. And the Truman Doctrine is also a commitment, somewhat of one, to Greece and Turkey anyway. NATO would be to Europe as a whole. And we'll look at those international relations, political and social interactions, and the Cold War will be the theme. So let's jump into the Cold War and talk about what the Cold War is. The Cold War was really not considered at like physical war with people killing one another, although there are going to be some implications of Cold War. Can talk about what happens after World War II. And we got to look at the language of the standards again. This is a standards-based classroom, so let's do that. And we're going to start with 20. Here's 20. Here we have A, B, C, D, E. We have 5 substandards. Alright, so let's look at this top one here. The student will analyze the domestic and international impact of the Cold War on the United States. So we're going to analyze how the Cold War impacted the United States domestically and internationally. Okay. Alright, so here we are in Unit 8, preparation for the U.S. History End of Course test. Unit 8 is going to have all of Standard 20 in it, and Standard 21D is going to be in there. It's about Sputnik, the Soviet unmanned satellite. We'll talk about those. But the title here is America as a World Power, the Cold War, and this whole unit's about post-World War II foreign policy. Foreign policy, United States policies toward other nations. We're going to talk